He had promised himself, the day they lowered the flag-draped box into the cold Manitoba ground, that he would never let another dog break his heart. Russell Calloway kept that promise for 11 years. He kept it through the funeral of his wife, through the slow rot of his own silence, through every winter he spent alone in a cabin tucked against the Selkirk Mountains, where the snow fell deep enough to bury a man's whole history. And then, on the meanest night of a January cold snap, he found 3 German Shepherd puppies shivering against the body of their dead mother at the bottom of his own logging road, and the smallest one looked up at him as if it already knew his name. He turned to walk away. He told himself it was not his problem, but that smallest pup would not let him go, and before the night was through, 3 half-frozen strangers would do what no chaplain, no doctor, and no passing year had managed to do. They would teach a broken man how to feel again. If a story about loyalty and second chances means something to you, take a moment to tell everyone in the comments which town or city you're watching from tonight. And if you believe that grace sometimes arrives on 4 small paws, go ahead and subscribe, because the channel was built for people exactly like you. The Kootenays in deep winter have a particular kind of quiet, the sort that settles into a person's bones and stays there. Up the valley from the hamlet of Cedar Bend, where Slocan Lake lay frozen and gray under a sky, the color of old pewter, Russ Calloway stood on his porch the way he stood most evenings. One hand around a mug of coffee gone lukewarm, the other resting on the cedar rail his late wife had sanded smooth with her own hands a lifetime ago. He was 62 years old, broad through the shoulders still, though the years had begun their patient work of bending him. His hair had gone the silver of frost on a fence wire, cut short out of old habit, and his beard had grown in coarse and gray. A thin scar traced the line of his jaw, a souvenir from a place he never named aloud, and his eyes had the flat, watchful stillness of a man who had spent a career deciding very quickly who lived and who did not. He had been a Navy SEAL once, back when the word retired would have made him laugh. He had married a girl from Nelson named Marin on a borrowed weekend between deployments. And she had loved him with a patience that bordered on the miraculous, waiting through the silences he could not explain, holding the line at home while he held it everywhere else. Cancer took her 2 springs ago, quietly, the way it takes the brave ones, and now her reading glasses still sat folded on the windowsill because Russ could not make his hand throw them out. The cabin was spotless and bare, ordered like a man's last stand. The only photograph he allowed himself stood face down on the mantel most days. In it, a younger Russell knelt in a desert, the color of bone beside a sable German shepherd named Atlas. 90 pounds of muscle and devotion, the dog who had found the wire before it found the patrol, the dog who had taken the blast meant for his handler, and died with his head against Russ's boot, looking up not with fear, not with blame, but with that terrible unbroken trust. It was the trust Russ could never set down, not the war, not the loss. The trust. That was why he hated German shepherds now, hated the noble slope of their backs and the prick of their ears, hated the way the sight of one could open a door inside him he had spent a decade nailing shut. So when the sound came that night, threaded thin through the howl of the wind off the lake, Russ told himself it was nothing. A coyote, maybe. A branch dragging across the tin roof of the woodshed. He sat back down in his chair with a book he was not reading and let the fire crack and settle. The sound came again, higher this time, and smaller and unmistakably alive. Something in him that had never fully stood down rose to attention. He cursed under his breath, pulled on his parka and his toque, took the heavy flashlight from its hook by the door, and stepped into a cold so sharp it felt like swallowing glass. -28, the thermometer said, and the wind made a liar of even that. The beam of his light filled with spinning white as he made his way down the rutted logging road, his bad knee complaining at every step, until the cone of light caught something at the bottom of the grade where the road dipped toward the creek. It was a dog, a young female German shepherd, lean as a working dog ought to be, her tan and black coat stiff with ice curled in a tight protective arc around the mouth of a collapsed cardboard box. Someone had thrown from a truck and left to the mountain. She was dead. She had been dead a few hours, and even in death her body was still wrapped around what she had spent the last of her warmth trying to save. Pressed into the curve of her frozen belly were 3 puppies, no more than 5 weeks old, so cold that two of them had stopped crying. Russ's breath stopped in his chest. Of all the animals God could have set down in his path, it had to be these. The old desert opened up inside him. The heat, the dust, the weight of Atlas going still in his arms, and the wall he had built so carefully shuddered on its foundation. "No," he said aloud, and his voice cracked on the single word. "Not mine, not my mission." He meant to turn around. He had turned around, and then he heard a sound behind him in the snow, a small dry scraping, and he looked back. The smallest of the three had pulled herself free of her dead mother's side. She was a pale thing, nearly cream beneath the mud and frost, too weak to stand, and she did not bark or whimper. She simply dragged her tiny body forward across the snow, one trembling inch at a time, leaving a thin furrow behind her, until she reached the toe of his boot. Then she laid her head against the cold leather and shut her eyes, as if she had finally arrived somewhere. She had been crawling toward her whole short life. Russ stood looking down at her. She weighed almost nothing, and yet she pressed against him harder than any order he had ever been given, harder than the medals in the drawer he never opened, harder than grief itself. The storm roared around them both, but inside that small surrender there was a silence deeper than any mountain. "Stay," the silence said. "Don't leave me. Not you." His face twisted. For a long moment he looked angry enough to fight the heavens. Then his shoulders dropped, and he went down on both knees in the snow. He unzipped his parka and tucked the pale runt against the bare warmth of his chest. Then he gathered the other two, a sturdy sable male whose paws were already too big for his body, and a small black female so still he had to hold his breath to be sure she was breathing, and folded them in against his heart, 3 fading sparks. He looked one last time at the mother who had died doing the only job that mattered to her, and he bowed his head to her the way he had once bowed it to men who had given everything, and then he turned back up the road into the wind. "Hold the line," he growled to the bundle against his chest. "Nobody dies on me tonight. Not one of you." The cabin door slammed shut behind him, and the storm vanished into a muffled roar. Russ knelt by the wood stove and drew the puppies out one at a time onto a folded wool blanket, working with the brisk, narrow focus of a man back in a triage tent, because that was the only way he knew to do a thing that frightened him. The sable male came out first, and even half dead he tried to shove his blunt little muzzle against Russ's palm, as though personally insulted by his own weakness. "You've got some nerve for a half-pound of trouble," Russ muttered, and something almost like the ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. He called the pup Boone after the stubbornness of him, and the name stuck before he'd decided to keep any of them at all. The black female came next, silent, watchful, her amber eyes already moving over the room as if cataloging the exits. She did not struggle. She simply studied him, and the steadiness of it unsettled the old soldier in him in a way he couldn't name. "Raven," he said, because she was the color of the birds that wheeled over the lake, and because there was something old and knowing in her. And last, the pale one, the runt, the one who had crawled to his boot. She was the color of cream beneath the dirt, her ears still folded soft, her breath so faint he had to lean down to find it. Russ looked at her longer than he meant to. "Juno," he said finally, and the name felt dangerous in his mouth, the way Hope always did. He warmed evaporated milk in a saucepan and fed them drop by drop from a needless syringe. Boone fighting, and gulping and bubbling milk down his chin, Raven drinking with quiet discipline, both of them rallying as the heat soaked back into their small bodies. But Juno would not rouse. Her head lolled against his fingers. Her tongue lay still. Russ rubbed her throat, squeezed a drop onto her lip, leaned close to listen, and found her heartbeat thin as thread and slowing. Blankets would not be enough. The fire would not be fast enough. She needed living heat. He looked at his hands, scarred and steady, the hands he had used for a decade to keep the whole world at arm's length. Then he looked at the dying scrap of a dog in his palm. With a sound low in his throat, he pulled off his flannel and the thermal beneath it, sat back bare-chested in the cold air, and laid Juno directly over his own heart, wrapping the wool blanket tight around them both. At first, she felt like ice against his skin. Russ made himself breathe slow, his lungs working like a bellows feeding the smallest fire in the world. Minutes crawled past. The storm clawed the roof, and then, against the cage of his ribs, he felt it. A tiny nose pressing blindly toward his warmth, a paw flexing, and underneath it all a fast, faint heartbeat reaching for his own and finding it. Something inside Russell Calloway gave way without a sound. Atlas came back to him then, not dying, not bleeding into the sand, but running across a green field in some country that no longer existed, ears up, tongue lolling, alive. And the tear that slid down into his gray beard was so unexpectedly hot it startled him. He rested one hand flat on Juno's back and did not pull it away. "All right," he whispered into the dark, "I've got you." He did not say he loved her. He did not say he was keeping them. But his hand stayed steady on her small back until her heartbeat grew sure. And for the first time in 11 winters, the silence in the cabin did not feel like a grave. Spring came late and reluctant to the high country, and by the time the snow pulled back off the south-facing slopes, Russ Calloway's tidy cabin had been conquered. Boone Raven and Juno were 4 months old now, all ears and elbows and absurd confidence, and they had turned a former seal's fortress of order into a kingdom ruled by chewed boots and overturned water dishes and small crimes committed before sunrise. Boone had grown into the biggest, a powerful sable youngster who regarded every chair leg as enemy infrastructure. Raven moved through the cabin like a small black shadow with a plan, studying hinges and latches and the habits of the man who fed her. And Juno had become a lean, graceful, cream-colored ghost who stole blankets from every room and dragged them into sunlit piles, and who always seemed to know, before Russ knew it himself, when his knee was aching or his chest had gone tight. He told himself he was not attached. He said it while scrubbing paw prints off the counter, and while fishing a sock from Boone's jaws, and while waking at dawn to find Juno asleep across his boots, and Raven sitting sentry at the bedroom door. The lie had grown comfortable. It almost kept him warm. The trouble came on a gray afternoon of spitting rain. Russ had gone out to the woodshed to split kindling, leaving the 3 of them inside for what he swore was 10 minutes, and was closer to 25. When he came back, the cabin met him with silence, and any man who has lived with 3 shepherd pups knows that silence is not peace. Silence is a conspiracy. He found Boone standing by the open low drawer of the bureau, tail wagging, immensely proud, with something soft and pale hanging from his mouth. It was Marin's scarf. The blue one, the one that still, after 2 years, held the faintest trace of her. And beside it on the floor, knocked from the same drawer, lay the small velvet box that held her wedding ring, sprung open, the ring catching the dull window light. For 1 full second Russ was not in the cabin at all. He was in the hospice room at 3 in the morning, holding a hand that had stopped holding back. The past, which usually came as a ghost, arrived like a fist. "Drop it," he said, and his voice was so quiet that all 3 pups froze. Boone, confused, let the scarf fall. "You don't touch that," Russ said, and the words came out of him crueler than he meant, ugly things grabbed up off the floor of an old grief. "You hear me? You're not, you tear up everything. Everything you put your teeth in. Get out. All of you. Out." He herded them onto the back porch and into the rain and shut the door and stood in the kitchen with his late wife's scarf pressed to his face, shaking. The cabin was quiet again. It was clean. It was exactly what he had asked the world for, and it was unbearable. For 2 hours he sat at the table telling himself they were fine, they had the dry straw in the woodshed, dogs were tougher than people imagined. The words got thinner every time. When the rain turned to a hard, cold downpour, he finally crossed to the window and pulled back the curtain, meaning only to check. They had not gone to the woodshed. 3 shapes sat in the streaming mud, 6 feet from the glass, soaked to the skin, shivering. Boone in the center, chin up, watching the black tree line. Juno on the right, small and drenched, and Raven nearest the window, her body turned outward toward the dark, guarding the house, guarding him, from whatever the night might bring. He had thrown them out into the storm, and they had simply taken up a post. A sound came out of Russ that he did not recognize as his own. Raven turned at it, rose, walked to the glass, and set one muddy paw flat against the window exactly where his hand rested on the other side. There was no reproach in her amber eyes. Only concern. "Are you all right in there?" "I'm the fool," Russ whispered. "I'm the one who forgot." He threw the door open and they poured in, dragging mud and pine needles and the wild smell of the mountain, and he went down on his knees in the mess of it, and gathered all 3 soaked bodies into his arms and pressed his face into their wet fur. Behind him on the table, Marin's scarf lay folded where he had left it. He understood, kneeling there, that the people we lose do not want us to live the rest of our lives like a locked house. He understood that loyalty was not a thing you kept in a drawer. It was alive and shivering and choosing, against all sense, to stand guard outside a broken man's heart. By midsummer, the three of them were 6 months old and long-legged and magnificent, and Russ had started taking them down the valley to the general store at Cedar Bend, where Fay Thibodeau ran the till and the post office, and, as far as Russ could tell, the moral life of the entire hamlet. Fay was 73, slight and silver-haired, a retired nurse with warm brown eyes behind her reading glasses, and a hip that gave her a careful rolling walk. She had known Marin. Worse, she remembered the man Russ had been before, and she had a way of looking at him over those glasses that made his solitude feel less like dignity, and more like a wound he was refusing to dress. "They're good dogs," she told him one July afternoon, watching the three of them lie in perfect formation outside her door while a logging truck rattled past. "Better than you deserve, probably." Then, more gently, the way you'd say a thing you'd been holding a while, "Marin would be glad. You ought to know that." Russ didn't answer, but he didn't argue either, and Fay counted that as progress. The cougar came on a still, brutally hot afternoon in August, when even the cicadas sounded exhausted. Russ was down at the lower fence line, mending a stretch of wire, the dogs lying in the shade of a cedar 20 meters off, when Raven rose without a sound, her hackles lifting into a black ridge along her spine. Russ followed her gaze and felt his blood go cold. A cougar had come down out of the timber, a big lean tom close to 70 kilos, drawn by the smell of the dog food in the shed and made bold by a hard season. It was not a monster. That was the worst of it. It was simply hungry, and it had decided. "Back," Russ ordered low. He had no rifle. The cat kept coming, head swinging, tail low. Russ stood up tall, raised his arms, made himself huge, shouted. A normal cougar would have broken off. This one only flattened its ears and slid another step closer, toward the shed, toward the cabin, toward him. Boone broke. "No," Russ roared, but the young dog was already across the grass, 60 pounds of love, wearing courage like a borrowed coat, snapping at the cat's forelegs, darting and retreating, trying with everything in him to drive the giant back. For one wild instant the cougar recoiled, astonished by the sheer nerve of the thing. Then instinct answered instinct, and one heavy paw caught Boone across the shoulder and head and sent him tumbling through the dry grass, where he rolled once and lay still. The world narrowed to that small, motionless shape. Whatever the seal in Russ had been trained to do, it vanished, and what rose up in its place was older than any war, the plain, animal rage of a father. He came across that field roaring, swinging a fence post, smashing it down against a rock with a crack like a rifle shot, making himself louder and madder than anything the cat wanted to deal with. Raven and Juno flew in from the flanks, barking in sharp bursts, never close enough to be caught, filling the air with chaos. The cougar huffed, wheeled, and melted back into the timber, deciding that no meal was worth this gray-bearded madman and his 3 impossible dogs. Russ dropped the post and ran to Boone. "No, you don't. Come on, son." Boone's eyes fluttered, blood matted one ear and his breath came uneven, but when Russ ran his hands over the ribs, the young dog groaned and gave one weak thump of his tail. Juno was already pressed against him, licking his muzzle in a frenzy of tenderness. Raven stood facing the woods, rigid, a black statue guarding them all. He carried Boone up to the cabin and laid him on the sofa, a place no dog had ever been permitted, and sat on the floor beside him as the long light failed, one hand on the warm rise and fall of the dog's chest. "You are not a thing I found," he said quietly into the dim room. "You are not a stray I'm minding until somebody comes." Boone exhaled, soft and trusting. Russ bowed his head until his forehead rested against the dog's fur. "You're mine, your family, and God help whatever forgets it." The hardest stretch came in the dead of the following January, almost a year to the night since he'd found them. Russ went out before dawn to clear the path to the woodshed, and his boot found a sheet of black ice under the new snow. He went down hard, the way men his age go down, and felt something tear-deep in his back where an old piece of the war had been waiting 2 decades to finish its work. He could not get up. The cold came for him fast, and behind it came a fever from the cut on his head. And by the time he dragged himself by his fingernails through the snow and into the cabin, He was no longer fully in the present. The ceiling fan became rotor blades. The cold floor became sand. He muttered names the dogs did not know, Atlas and a boy named Davies, and once, softly, Marin. And the dogs, who could not understand fever but understood a fallen leader perfectly well, took up their stations. Boone lay across the threshold of the bedroom, head up, ears alert, his hunger forgotten beneath duty. The door was the line and nothing would cross it. Raven moved through the cabin with silent purpose, nosing open the cupboard where the towels were, dragging one to the man on the floor, pressing her cold nose to his cheek to check that he still answered. And Juno found the last inch of water in the dish, drank it, climbed onto the man despite every rule he had ever taught her, and pressed her wet muzzle to his cracked lips, carrying water from her own mouth to his, one ridiculous holy mouthful at a time. The fever broke on the third night, and it broke like a dam letting go. Russ came awake gasping, certain the walls were closing in, his heart slamming, unable to pull a full breath. The old panic wearing the mask of death, and it was Raven who moved first. The black dog climbed onto the bed with a calm older than instinct and lowered her whole weight across his chest, her head beside his ear, and held still. The pressure forced him to slow, to breathe against the weight of her rather than flee inside his own ruined body. She let out one long, deep breath, and his lungs, trapped beneath that steady black anchor, had no choice but to follow it. In and out, in and out. The desert receded, the cabin came back, board by board, until the only sounds were the wood stove ticking and 3 dogs breathing in the dark. He woke to gray daylight and the smell of dog fur and survival. His back was a wreck and his head ached, but the fever was gone. Boone still held the door. Raven slept heavies across his legs. Juno lay curled in the crook of his arm, her cream head tucked beneath his hand. Their dishes were empty. Their eyes were exhausted. They had not left him. "You stood post," he whispered, and his voice cracked clean through. 3 days. I thought I was the one who saved you." Juno's tail thumped once against the blanket. Russ closed his eyes. "Turns out," he said, "it was the other way around the whole time." He telephoned Faye that morning. The first time in years he had asked another living soul for help, and she drove her old wagon up the unplowed road and made him soup and scolded him with her eyes, and did not once mention how long it had taken him to call. That was the winter Russell Calloway stopped, pretending he could do it alone. The dogs were nearly a year and a half old, in their first full glory when Garrett Pike came up the valley. He pulled into the yard in a clean black truck, a narrow man in his 50s with a smooth, handsome face that held no warmth, an expensive jacket, and the easy confidence of someone who had never once been told no and meant it. He ran a breeding kennel down near the coast. He explained, working lines, protection dogs for executive clients, and he had heard from a man at the feed store that there was a litter up the Slocan with exceptional bone. His eyes went straight to Boone and stayed there. "That's a remarkable sable," Pike said. "Papered. He's breathing," Russ said. "That was the only requirement when I found him in a ditch." Pike smiled the way a man smiles at a joke he intends to ignore. He said the litter was his, in point of fact, that they'd been bred at his kennel and stolen out of a transport, and that he had paperwork, and that he'd be taking what was his, though he was prepared to be generous about it and leave the old man one. Russ let him talk. He had met men like Pike on 3 continents, men who looked at a living thing and saw a number, and he had learned that the loud ones expected you to be loud back. He was not loud. "You threw them out of a truck on the worst night of the year," Russ said evenly, "and left their mother to freeze around them so they'd live an hour longer than she did. I buried her up the hill. I can show you the spot if your paperwork wants to see it." Pike's smile faltered. By then, Faye had come out onto the porch with the cordless phone and the quiet news that the RCMP detachment in town would be very interested in his transport records and his paperwork both, and a couple of trucks had slowed on the road. The way trucks do in a place where everyone knows whose dogs those are. "You really ought to control your assets," Pike said, tight now, reaching toward Boone. The growl that came out of Boone silenced the whole yard. Russ laid a hand on the dog's shoulder. "Leave it," he said, and Boone went still, eyes never leaving the man. Russ stepped in front of his dog, and the old seal filled the space without lifting a hand. "An asset is what you tried to buy," he said. "What told you no is my family. Now get off my mountain." Garrett Pike got off the mountain. He never came back, and no paperwork ever surfaced, and in Cedar Bend the story grew in the telling, the way the good ones do. The last hard test came that autumn, when the larches on the high slopes had turned to gold and a warm spell off the Pacific rotted the early ice on Slocan Lake from below. Russ had Juno down at the shore one gray afternoon. Only Juno, because Boone and Raven were back at the cabin with a beef bone Fay had brought, when a logging truck somewhere up the highway hit its Jake brake with a crack like a gunshot. Juno had always carried the cold in her, some deep memory of the night she was born. Loud, sudden sounds undid her. She bolted out across the lake ice before Russ could close his hand on her collar, a white streak skating toward the middle where the ice was rotten and gray. "Juno, down, down, girl!" But fear was faster than love, and then came a sound that stopped his heart entirely, a soft, deep crunch and a splash, and Juno's head going under and coming up, her front paws scrabbling at an edge of ice that broke away in her teeth every time she found it. Russ did not think. He started out onto the ice on his belly, spreading his weight, dragging himself toward the dark crack of open water, his bad back screaming, the cold soaking through to his ribs. Behind him he heard Fay's wagon skid to a stop on the shore road, and her voice, sharp as a church bell, calling his name. And then, impossibly, 2 more sets of paws, because Fay had let Boone and Raven out, and they came low and flat across the ice with a wisdom Russ would never afterward be able to explain. Raven reached the edge first and clamped her jaws on the scruff of Juno's neck, bracing, holding her sister's head above the black water while her paws scrabbled for purchase. Boone planted himself behind Russ like a living anchor, 60 kilos of stubborn courage, and let the old man grip his harness. Fay, on the shore, had her late husband's tow rope from the wagon and threw the coil out across the ice, and Russ looped it under his arms with hands gone numb, and inch by terrible inch, old woman hauling, sable dog bracing, black dog refusing to let go of her sister's neck. They drew Juno up out of the lake. She came free with a heave that nearly took Russ under, and he wrapped her against his chest exactly as he had on the first night of her life, her whole body shaking so hard her teeth clicked, and he crawled them all back to solid ground while the rotten ice groaned its disappointment behind them. "No one gets left," he kept saying, over and over, into her soaked fur. "Not on the ice, not in the cold, not ever again. You hear me? No one." Months later the snow returned to the Selkirks, soft and forgiving, and the cabin no longer felt like a fortress waiting out a siege. It smelled of coffee and cedar shavings and dog, and there was bread on the counter that Fay left because she claimed Russ would starve himself out of pure stubbornness otherwise. Juno's paw still ached in the cold, and she still hated the sound of trucks, and Boone still slept across the door, and Raven still watched the windows. On the mantel, Russ had finally stood the desert photograph upright, and beside it he had set his old folded flag, and Marin's wedding ring in its velvet box left open to the light, and 3 small puppy collars worn thin and far too little now for the guardians they had become. He stood in front of all of it for a long while one evening, and what he was saying goodbye to was not Atlas, and not Marin, but the guilt he had chained to their memories for so long that he had forgotten the difference between honoring the dead and refusing to live. Then he stepped out onto the porch into the falling snow. Boone lay down across his boots. Raven settled at his left. Juno rested her head against his knee. The lake lay white and quiet below them, and the lights of Cedar Bend glowed small and warm down the valley, and the cold that came down off the mountain was just cold now. Nothing more, because there was a home behind him with a fire in it, and 3 souls who had decided, on the worst night of their lives, to belong to him. Maybe somewhere out there is a person carrying a grief no one else can see. A person who has locked a door inside themselves and thrown the key down some dark well, certain it can never be opened again. But a broken man on a mountain learned the truth that one bitter January, the truth that grace rarely comes with thunder or trumpets, that more often it crawls toward you through the snow on tiny paws, lays its head against your boot, and refuses, against all reason, to let you go alone into the dark. No one is ever truly past saving, and no soul, not the smallest, not the coldest, not the most certain it deserves to be left behind, should ever be left out in the cold.